correct.
And as the director of engineering for Summit, you also were personally involved in creation of the dispersion model that was discussed at that meeting?
That is correct.
There's a binder to, I believe the one to your left. If I could just have you turn to Exhibit BC 119.
Is it the API technical guidance, CO2 technical guidance?
Correct. And I believe you'd even mentioned this document in your testimony earlier. I assume you're familiar with this?
That is correct.
Is this a document that Summit provided to the various first responders and emergency response directors at the various counties?
It appears so.
And this one, actually, if you turn back to BC 118, this appears to be a cover email where this document is listed among the ones that were sent to Mary Sanger at Burleigh County. Do you see that? I believe it's the first document listed.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, turning back to BC 119. This looks on its cover here to be a guide developed by the American Petroleum Institute and Liquid Energy Pipeline Association with input from the National Association of State Fire Marshals. Is that accurate?
That is my understanding, yes.
And it was published in August of 2023, so relatively recent, correct?
That is correct.
And is this document specific to CO2 pipelines?
Yes.
Is it your understanding that this is an authoritative document, or that Summit considers this an authoritative document on preparedness for response, or preparedness for response to a pipeline release of carbon dioxide?
In regards to it being federal regulations, no, but it does provide good guidelines in regards to a variety of CO2 emergency response planning or preparedness for information.
And if you kind of look on every other page on the right side of it, it says best practice guidelines, kind of what it refers to it as itself. Would you describe it as best practice guidelines?
I would.
Does Summit attempt to comply with the requirements contained in this guideline?
I can't say definitively that we comply with every single guideline, but there are a number of them that we have used and considered when developing our procedures or dispersion model.
As part of your presentation and communications with the counties, did you explain to any of those county representatives that not all of the things within this guideline are complied with?
We did not, and as I just mentioned, I just, without rereading it right now, I can't say definitively that every single item in this we are complying with.
Did you have a conversation with any representative of Burleigh County where you explained that not every provision in here is necessarily complied with?
I don't remember that.
This document was talked about at your presentation, though?
Typically, they are talked about. A lot of individuals will ask, what does a CO2 release look like? And this does provide good graphics in regards to what would you visually see in a CO2 release.
Let's turn on this exhibit to page 10. And I'm looking at section 4 here on page 10, and it's called Dispersion Modeling Best Practices. It says there at the beginning, the potential for CO2 pipeline systems to affect high consequence areas must be evaluated. Is that something that Summit did an evaluation of?
So that's referencing, and it's called out on the bottom, 195-452 does require all operators to identify risks to high consequence areas. And so that's the federal regulation minimum. Summit has completed dispersion modeling for all pipeline segments independent of whether they can affect a HCA or not.
That goes on to say that modeling is conducted to estimate the potential worst case consequences in the event of pipeline rupture in or near an HCA. Is that something that Summit has done, modeling based on the worst case consequences event?
We have modeled worst case consequences, yes.
Is that part of the dispersion model that was discussed in your earlier testimony?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for the content of confidential information.
Your Honor, I would argue that it's a general topic similar to what was testified to earlier, and whether or not it's covered, not the values or any specifics from the model.
I'll let him answer generally, but we won't get into the specifics.
In the presentations, one of the dispersion models we showed was a worst case release type that we talked about previously, the guillotine full bore rupture.
Third sentence, would that be covered by that? It talks about the consequence analysis calculations should be performed for full bore pipeline rupture under worst case operating and atmospheric conditions.
Again, I'm going to object that this is getting into content of what was modeled, what wasn't modeled, what the inputs and outputs were. And that is all part of what's covered by the protective order.
May I respond?
Sure.
Your Honor, this document is already in evidence, and it was provided to Burleigh County as best practices. And I'm not asking about any specifics, just simply, did you in fact carry out those best practices? And I don't have any follow-up questions on the details of what the model shows as to these topics. But I think Burleigh County should be able to confirm that the information that was given to it is in fact accurate.
And to that degree, I would object, asked and answered, as Mr. Lang testified. This paragraph goes to the content of the federal regulation, and Summit will abide by the federal regulation.
Is your question specific to the meetings or in general?
I think my question wasn't specific to the meetings. I think in general, has Summit in fact done this analysis?
And I think he did testify to that already, that they've complied with those. So I do believe it's been answered.
Thank you, Your Honor. Moving on, there is a list in that paragraph of key inputs. It says listed below are key inputs to most of the models that can impact the calculated potential impact area. The first item there is pipeline parameters, and it lists various parameters that you can read there. Did Summit use these inputs in its model?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Yeah, I think we're getting to the specifics, so I'm going to sustain that objection.
Summit provided this document to Burleigh County, correct?
That is correct.
And Summit has never provided any document to Burleigh County for them to be able to analyze whether these best practices have been followed?
Can you rephrase that?
As Summit has not provided any additional documentation to Burleigh County for Burleigh County to be able to analyze whether you've followed the best practices that are listed in the document you provided them.
Summit has provided, and I think it was called out in a prior reference, BC 118, a few documents to Burleigh County. To my knowledge, I have not received any feedback from Burleigh County on their own internal analysis of the documents provided.
the various documents that were provided that are listed on BC 118 as to all of those. Did you have any conversation with anybody at Burleigh County discussing whether Summit would comply with every provision in each of those documents?
We did not have that conversation.
That information is not available to members of the public either, correct?
Can you clarify that one?
The various documents that were provided to Burleigh County that are listed on BC 118. As you sit here today, you don't know if Summit has complied or intends to comply with all of the provisions of all of those documents. Is that a fair statement?
I think that there's a number of documents in here where there is really no compliance you can have. And so some of these are more of an educational purpose in regards to like your shelter in place study, right? That document is purely a study on is shelter in place an adequate means for protective measures. It's not so much that there are requirements within that shelter in place document that Summit can abide by.
The next paragraph in this section talks about the influence of surrounding topography. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you agree that north and east of Bismarck, there's terrain with a significant topographic relief?
I'm sorry, could I ask Mr. Phillips to pull the microphone slightly closer? I didn't hear the end of that question.
Do you agree that north and east of Bismarck, there's terrain with significant topographic relief? In other words, variation in elevation and slope.
I think it depends how you define significant. When I look at topography and the digital elevation maps around this area, I would consider the west side of the Missouri River to have significantly more severe kind of elevation changes.
You start north of Bismarck, generally the terrain slopes towards the city. Isn't that right?
I don't know that I know that answer firsthand, but that's my general understanding, yes.
Towards the Missouri River Valley?
I think that's generally correct, yes.
There's that paragraph. It starts with similarly in paragraph or section 4 on page 10. And it says, a sentence into there, it says, similar to wind, it is particularly problematic when the direction of the terrain relief is in the direction of a populated area or HCA. The use of atmospheric dispersion modeling coupled with overland spread analysis using computational fluid dynamics modeling may be necessary in these areas. And it continues on to recommend computational fluid dynamics modeling. Do you see that part?
I do.
And just that last sentence of that paragraph says, in these areas, to truly understand whether a nearby HCA could be affected by a CO2 release, CFD modeling can be added in order to determine the additional dispersion distance and ultimately determine whether the dispersion plume might impact a nearby HCA at any given point on the pipeline. Did I understand your testimony earlier that there was not computational fluid dynamics modeling done with the software that was used by Summit or its contractor?
In my engineering opinion, you somewhat get into the nuances of what CFD is and is not. We did use Flow 2D, which is addressed in my written testimony. That does include the use of digital elevation maps with inputs from our Canary output model to help understand how a heavy vapor would flow with terrain.
Did I understand your testimony earlier that there is additional software packages available for computational fluid dynamics that was not used by Summit or its contractor?
I think that's fair. I think even with vapor dispersion, there are other options available outside of Canary.
I believe you've been asked questions about whether that would be required for more complex scenarios. Is that fair?
Can you repeat that question?
No, I'll strike the question. It's fine. Did you tell anybody at Burleigh County that you would not be using computational fluid dynamics as part of the dispersion model?
I don't recall that level of detail from the meeting.
It's fair to say that the best practices in this document that you provided to Burleigh County suggested that it be used in situations where the topography slopes towards a populated area.
I would say that this document says that CFD modeling may be necessary in some areas.
Did Summit conduct an analysis of whether it would be necessary in Burleigh County?
As I testified to earlier, Summit, and I guess myself personally, we're very comfortable with the dispersion modeling we've conducted. And when it comes to topography and the use of the digital elevation maps through Flow 2D in combination with Canary, gave us the information that we needed to understand how topography could play a role.
And as you testified earlier, the dispersion model is not available to Burleigh County or the public at large to confirm any of that. Correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Give me one moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have some additional questions regarding the inputs, but in light of your ruling on the objection, I'm not going to go ahead and ask those, but I'll just reiterate that we would intend to admit those and are not pursuant to your order. And with that, I have no further questions.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Chrisman?
Were you at all the meetings that are laid out in your testimony with the lists of attendees and invitees who did not attend?
Yes, I was the presenter at every single one.
Okay. How would you assess the responses? And the kinds of things I'm looking for are, how often were people requesting specific equipment or requesting more meetings or requesting more detailed information than you were able to give?
Yeah, I think that we'll kind of break that down. One is for additional meetings. And so if you look at that list, there was at least one incident, or not incident, but we did Oliver and Mercer County twice. And so the first time we were out at Oliver and Mercer, it was during the workday, and so didn't have the best attendance. And so those counties reached out, said we would like to set up another one. And so we did follow up on May 16th. In regards to equipment, generally not a lot of conversation there. In Cass County, the emergency manager did ask, when it comes to things like CO2 detectors, who would be responsible for paying for those for their first responders. But in regards to additional equipment needs, I don't recall any other requests. And then generally we'll sometimes get questions in regards to specific atmospheric conditions, winter, summer, different wind speeds, things along those lines. And so I don't know, that's a kind of general tone. But I think ultimately what I've seen from all these presentations is that there are, as you guys are aware, a significant number of pipelines in the state of North Dakota. And so I think that a lot of these emergency managers are familiar with the safety practices, the emergency response training process that operators abide by in the state and under those federal regulations. And so just familiarity with pipelines in general.
But outside of a few counties, this being a different commodity than most of them are used to dealing with, was there any discussion like that this is going to be an annual thing or a monthly thing or a one and done training?
Yeah, so when we start the training, we really kind of give the background of that this is ultimately kind of the foundation of what will be coming. And so for a lot of these first responders, when you talk about emergency response planning and preparedness, you need to make sure that you understand dispersion modeling and what constitutes dispersion modeling, what tools do we have available to us so that we can help educate first responders. At the end of the day, my background is engineering. And so some of those topics that are important to first responders, I may not be aware of until we start to hold some of those conversations. And so it is a collaborative effort in that regard in sharing information.
And the responses you got, whether it's questions, statements, was it mostly from the political side, the city commissioners, the county commissioners, et cetera, or mostly from the actual first responders?
I would say it was generally from the actual first responders.
And last, and I don't have it, I can't remember what page it's on, but maybe I missed one or I'm off something here, but as I scrolled through them, I think I noticed that in all the cases, one or more county commissioners were invited except Emmons County. Were there no, did something not get printed in here? Were there no county commissioners invited or what?
Unfortunately, I was not involved in the invitation list, and so I don't know the answer to that. I more or less just showed up to present the information, and so I can't speak to.
Who would have created the invitation list for Emmons County?
Most of it rolled through county emergency managers, and so they would propose kind of the majority of the list, and then if there are individuals, county commissioners that voiced to us that they would be interested in attending, that was something that we would have extended an invitation to them as well.
Okay. No other questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
Yeah, I do have questions. I don't even know where to begin on based on notes and what we just received as far as testimony. So bear with me. I'm gonna first go to your resume.
Okay.
And under the Summit Carbon Solutions, employment began September 2021 to present. You indicated that this is your first CO2 pipeline design.
That is correct.
Okay, you're leading a team of engineers. Under that team, how many of them have experience with CO2 pipelines?
On the internal side, the engineers from my team personally, there would be none. We do have employees at Summit, our control room manager who has CO2 experience. And then on the external side, there would be a significant number of employees that would have CO2 related experience.
What would you say that significant number is
The quantity of employees?
that have experience in CO2 pipeline when you say significant number?
It would likely, I mean, when you include all the contractors that are working on the project, Gulf Interstate, some of their project managers, David Ammerman was on the Dakota gasification project. And so if you start including contractors that support, whether it's the engineering side or the metallurgy side, you probably are close to a dozen.
And what would you say the years of experience are with those 12 people that you've identified?
Most of them would be in the probably 20 plus years range for each of those individuals.
Okay. You say you're responsible for the development of the company risk management, risk assessment and risk management process. Is that internal or internal and external?
We have external contractors that help us develop an internal risk management process under the integrity management program.
And how many of them have CO2 pipeline experience?
Some of those individuals will overlap between the engineering team and the risk management team, right? They play the same role. The main lead for risk management is a guy named Kent Mulbauer, and I do not know his CO2 experience, but he has extensive PHMSA background and experience. And if you read some of the documents that are ultimately issued through PHMSA, Kent is one of the authors on a lot of those when it comes to risk management, but I don't know his specific CO2 experience.
Fair enough. So when you sit on page 4 of your testimony, and you've alluded to this several times about laying the foundation, would you describe that, when you lay the foundation, and I've worked some in risk management and emergency response and all that, is information sharing, and as you go on, it gets more detailed and detailed, right?
I agree with that.
So who leads that detail of information? Would it be you as Summit, or do you expect emergency managers to lead that? What's your expectation? And, you're responsible for risk management and assessment.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately a collaborative effort. And so I think that a starting point is that Summit does provide a lot of the information, right? But as time goes on, and similar to how the presentation has evolved over time, new questions come up, new topics come up. And so we want it to be a collaborative effort between us and those emergency managers and first responders. And so if there's information after that first take that they don't feel was appropriately addressed, that's something that we would work through with those individuals.
Where would Summit take the initiative and take the lead in regarding to working with emergency managers, first responders? Where's your lead role?
Yeah, sorry.
In what areas?
I think the overall development of that emergency response plan we would take the lead role on. It does also take some, once again, coordination with local responders in regards to what equipment do they have, where are resources based out of. But we would drive a lot of that when it comes to development of emergency response plans and making sure they feel that they're adequately, they have the adequate resources to help us respond. And so there are federal requirements as well in 195 in regards to how often we train first responders, things along those lines. And so we'll comply with all of that.
Give me a brief summary of that requirement that you just referenced.
You're talking about the 195 requirements for emergency managers. One of them is that you must have a training annually not to exceed, or every calendar year not to exceed every 15 months. And so within those timelines, we'll have to reach out to first responders across the project, bring them up to speed on where are we at with the project, any potential things that may have arisen on our project, and then really just continual education when it comes to first responders. And so that's one part of it. And then it's also, as I mentioned, development of emergency response plans. How do you respond to an incident? Things along those lines.
At these meetings, it's been referenced several times by Summit as far as the sign-in sheets are the actual documentation on who attended. And you referenced earlier, you don't know who has those sign-in sheets. So who's ultimately responsible for maintaining safety documentation? I mean, where does the repository of information lie, and with whom?
Yeah, I think it's a slightly more complex question than a simple answer. And so it's kind of broken out into different categories. And so when you look at relationships with emergency managers and first responders, Dave Dom has a lot of those relationships, especially when it comes to emergency response planning. When it comes to setting up the different meetings and owning kind of those sign-in sheets, that would really fall to what I would call our Bismarck office and really Wade's team. And so it's kind of a team effort where individuals will have specialties and will work together to answer whatever questions or topics may arise.
So someone has them.
My understanding is that someone has, maybe not all of them, but most or many of them, yes.
Where would they be? I mean, if you're saying that, if it's been testified that these sign-in sheets are documentation that these safety meetings, where would they be? I mean, why wouldn't you have them all to show that?
Yeah, when we first started the process, I don't know that the first couple meetings we maybe had sign-in sheets. I can't recall that far back. But ultimately, I do know that meeting invites exist in regards to who was invited to those meetings through Outlook. And then we do have a number of sign-in sheets that we use to validate who showed up to these number of meetings. And so I know that we use those when compiling the list of individuals that showed up.
You have stated several times and confident with the work Summit has done with dispersion modeling. You've used the word confident many times. So elaborate a little bit more on that. Here's, safety is a big thing for many people, very passionate. I could get very passionate about it, what I'm hearing from people, especially saying that, I'm going to say it, that we don't care about it, that we don't care about the citizens of North Dakota. That is so false. So false. So tell me why Summit is so confident in this pipeline and dispersion modeling and safety.
Yeah, I think it really started from the beginning in regards to how do we even determine a model to use. And so it really, without going into too many details, that some of those would be covered in the confidentiality order. It really started from the selection of a model and just a modeling software in general. And then it really goes down towards when we reference some of those documents in regards to worst case conditions and the modeling associated with that. Summit ultimately used extremely conservative values to kind of create some of these dispersion buffers to better understand, maybe not better understand, maybe it's bad phrasing, but to understand what is kind of that worst case type of condition and what may that look like. And without going into details on exact inputs and outputs that we have, it's a little difficult to answer that question here.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
I preface this by saying I am not a scientist. I do not know much about metallurgy or pipelines. So when I ask this, it's out of ignorance, but you talk about a break in a line being the worst case scenario. And then we hear about, if I understand correctly, if it got broken in any fashion, it would be colder than negative 50 degrees. And would a guillotine break in every circumstance because of that cold? Sooner or later, at least fracture?
I think what you're going back to the question I had earlier about brittle pipelines. And so try and word it. Really when we design a pipeline, we select a number of parameters, right, in regards to how are we going to design the pipeline, whether that's a temperature number, both in a minimum and maximum case, design temperature, whether that's pressure. And so when it comes to steel pipelines, you really want the steel to operate, or that metal to be in a ductile state. And so a ductile state allows for that pipeline to really deform without losing its material toughness. And if you go into a brittle state, deformation may lead to cracking and fracturing of your pipeline. And so by selecting the design criteria that we did and the temperature ranges that we did, and then ultimately following API 5L requirements for testing of your drop weight tear testing, you can validate that the steel and the composition of the steel that you selected will always operate within that ductile region. And so then you can sustain potential deformations without necessarily resulting in some type of fracture. And so it really comes down to how you specify your pipes and your metallurgy of your pipe. And so generally the answer would be no, is that you could have some type of smaller break, let's call it a pinhole leak from corrosion or whatnot, that would not result in a guillotine release. Did that answer your question?
I'd ask you to dumb it down some more, but that will do.
I apologize.
Mr. Dublinski, any redirect? All right, well, thank you, Mr. Lane. Next witness?
Your Honor, while we're between witnesses here, if Your Honor would like, we can commit to filing those sign-in sheets. We didn't because there may be some some meetings that there weren't sign-in sheets. In other cases, they may have been supplemented by people looking at them and saying, well, hold on, I remember this person was there. So I think that the typed will be more accurate, but if Your Honor would like to see those, we can certainly file those as a late filed exhibit.
That's something the commissioners would like.
I think you've, it's been answered for me, but I won't speak on behalf of the other two.
Right.
I'm fine with what we've had. No one's challenged it and said, no, this shows a person that unattended that didn't or anything like that. So it wasn't challenged, so I'm fine with the list.
I agree. The accuracy hasn't been challenged.
All right, no extra work for you.
Wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Your Honor, at this time, the applicant would call Wade Bosans.
Welcome back, Mr. Basons. I'll have you state your full name for the record. Do you want to turn is there a mic on?
Oh, no, it's not. Wayne Basons.
All right, and I know you've been sitting in the room all morning, so you heard me go through the penalties for perjury.
Yes, I did.
And you understand what perjury is?
I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Glut.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Basons, have you testified in these proceedings prior to today?
I have.
And you testified specifically at the April 22nd, 2024 hearing in Mandan, correct?
I did.
And in preparation for today's hearing, have you prepared written rebuttal testimony?
I did.
And was that testimony prepared by you or under your control and supervision?
It was.
And when you prepared that testimony, was it true and correct?
It was.
And as you sit here today, does your testimony remain true and correct?
It does.
Are there any corrections you need to make to your testimony?
No.
Your Honor, at this time, we move to admit Mr. Bason's written rebuttal testimony as SCR 19.
Any objection, Mr. Pelham?
No objection.
Mr. Jordy?
Your Honor, same objections as before, improper rebuttal and relevance. Thank you.
And Mr. Phillips?
I'll just join those objections for the same reasons.
All right, objections will be noted, but I will admit SCS 19.
All right, Mr. Bosanza, just want to highlight a couple of points from your written testimony. Were you here, or were you able to hear Mr. Wachter's testimony regarding the distance of the current pipeline route to his Silver Ranch development?
I did.
And Mr. Wachter testified that at the time, and based off a map that Burleigh County had produced, that distance was approximately 2 miles. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do not.
Could you please explain for the commission why you disagree?
Yeah, there was a map that was presented to Mr. Wachter, and he was asked that question. The map was Burleigh County 101. And specifically to that question, the map is, I have it in front of me here, relatively small scale. He was asked, what's the distance from 80th Street to the current pipeline route? If you look at the map, although you have to look very closely, you'll see that 80th Street is actually covered up by the text that labels Silver Ranch. And so you just can't tell the distance very easily or clearly on this map. Additionally, the route that was depicted was by Burleigh County was from preliminary information and not exactly accurate. So in my testimony, you'll see Exhibit A, and on Exhibit A, you see the route that was filed in October of 2022 in blue on that exhibit. You'll see the updated route, including the Bismarck reroute, which goes off of the page to the north in yellow and black dashed. And then you see that it's labeled, the actual distance is approximately 4 miles from 80th Street, which is the eastern extent of Silver Ranch to the current pipeline route. But again, it would be difficult for Mr. Wachter to detect that from this exhibit that he was looking at, given things weren't easily to read, given the small size of it. And so I just wanted to make that clarification.
And Mr. Wachter also testified that he was surprised to learn that the reroute to the east of Bismarck, where the pipeline crosses I-94, right around that area, actually moved closer to the city of Bismarck based on the map that Burleigh County had produced. Is that accurate?
No, it's not accurate. Again, Mr. Walker was presented with this Burleigh County 101 exhibit, or BC 101 exhibit, and they had predicted or mapped, I guess, based on some preliminary information, the pipeline route. And if you look at my Exhibit A, or excuse me, Exhibit B, you'll see the actual route. And on that route, again, you see the route that was filed in October of 2022 in blue, and you'll see the current route in yellow and black dashed. And so where we cross Interstate 94, you can see how the route has changed in that area as we worked, and I personally worked with the landowner there, Dale Pelkey, to make that adjustment where we didn't cut kitty corner across his field. We rather followed the tree line, which follows a transmission line, and came back to, towards the east, and then followed the property line again, straight to the north. And there was another landowner just on the north side of Pelkey's property who didn't want the route on their property, and so we routed off of them and onto landowners that have since signed easements. And so all of this was part of, we worked with, I think there was about a half a dozen landowners, and we developed this route and secured easements on roughly 6 miles. Some of it on the south side and some of it on the north side of the interstate at the same time. But that's the actual route. You can see how it's materially different than BC 101. You can also see that it didn't move any closer to the city of Bismarck.
And switch gears a little bit here, Mr. Basons. Did you have the opportunity to hear the testimony provided by Ben and Rose Dodson-Rod at the public hearing in Wapaton?
I did.
And did you hear the concerns expressed by the Dodson-Rods regarding their drainage easement?
I did.
Can you explain to the commission the steps Summit intends to take to address those concerns, please?
I can. So, as I understood, Mr. Dodson-Rod's concern was his drainage facility on the drainage easement that was not on his property, but was on the property adjacent to his. We're willing to bore underneath his line. As I understand it, he has a drainage pipeline in that easement that's draining is the main drain for his drain tiles. So we're, willing to commit to, the Dodson-Rods and Mr. Dodson-Rod that will bore under it and therefore not disturb that line. Additionally, we're working on an agreement that we are willing to present to the Dodson-Rods that will provide them indemnification and guarantee any indemnification from any loss related to our use of our easement and installation of our pipeline.
Your Honor, I don't have any further questions at this time. We would tender the witness for cross.
Mr. Pelham, any questions?
I don't, but Mr. Schick does.
So I think your written testimony does a good job of cleaning up the corridor width and the route buffer that you're requesting, but I just want to make sure I understand it clearly.
Sure.
So the current corridor you're requesting is 200 feet wide across the entirety of the project in North Dakota. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And a route typically is a infinitely small point, but in the last, say, 5 years or so, we've started to allow for route buffers just so that you can kind of work around things as you get out there in the field. So you're requesting a total of 50 feet wide, 25 feet on either side of the center line of the of any potential approved route as a buffer. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I think that's all I have. Sorry to clarify that. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. You had made some clarifications in relation to the testimony of Chad Wachter and relied on Exhibit A and B to your testimony. I just want to clarify, you're not here to rebut any other testimony from Chad Wachter in this case, correct? Just in relation to those two exhibits?
Yeah, I've only covered the two things. That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Jordy, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Sir, in your pre-filed testimony on page 4, you are posed a question about in certain situations it's not possible to implement every route adjustment requested. And one of the factors you list there says, quote, the further along in the process and the more parcels with signed easements, comma, the more constrained changes are. Would you agree that it doesn't become impossible, it's just less convenient for you in those situations?
I would disagree with that. Because absent the, all of the information, I can't say that it is possible. I can't say that it's not possible. So it's it depends answer.
All right, and I appreciate that because the question you were asked in line 8 on page 4 uses the word possible. And so just so that we're clear, you're not saying it's impossible to do the reroutes that my clients have suggested, are you?
I don't know that specifically. I'd have to look at the exact situation.
And the further along in the process, I mean, I guess I take that it would have been easier in your view to talk about reroutes and modifications a month ago, a year ago, I mean, 2 years ago. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I would say generally, it's a lot easier when you have all of the information sooner to address them together, which is kind of what this says.
And you say that you are willing to personally meet with the affected landowners to discuss possible alternatives. Now, you mean you're willing to speak with myself, Mr. Liable is their representative, and with them? I mean, you're willing to have a Zoom meeting with all of us to hammer this out, or what's the invitation you're offering up there?
Yeah, the invitation is to meet with the landowners, and if they choose to have their attorney present, I'm happy to accommodate that as well. So I wasn't that explicit in the invitation here, but that's what I would envision is the opportunity to hear from the landowners and understand what the possibilities are, and what could we work out and make work.
Okay, and so do you think, I mean, is the ball in your court? I mean, should I call you after you're done testifying to set this up? I mean, how do you envision that invitation actually turning into something?
Yeah, I would say you could reach out to our attorney, or if the landowners want to reach out to me personally, I'm happy to take their call.
Okay. And then as to the dots and rods, okay, you say you're willing to bore underneath the drainage easement, but the answer says is qualified absent any unforeseen constructability issues. So let's say hypothetically, sir, you were, meaning Summit was granted a permit, but it wasn't, or the application was granted, but it wasn't conditioned upon boring under the drainage easement. Based on your answer, you could rely on that qualification and say, well, something came up and we're not going to do it. Is that right?
I wouldn't characterize it that way. What that's meant to say is we would need to go out and meet with Mr. Dodson-Rod and look at the property, determine exactly what's there, do a constructability review and say, here's how we plan to cross this line. And the unforeseen part is, we won't know what's there until we actually uncover or start construction, if you will. Locate the line, and if there was something there that either us or Mr. Dodson-Rod doesn't know of today, then that's the unforeseen part.
And let's say that it plays out that way and you're out there and you're doing whatever analysis you think you need to do. Would you submit that then to the PSC? Because of course this, our question and answer period, the hearings would be over by then. And if you would agree to submit that, if it didn't show any constructability issues, would you be willing for there to be a condition in any order, should there be one, that requires you to bore underneath the Dodson-Rod drainage easement?
Yeah, I would say that, in my view, regardless of how we cross the line, we're offering an indemnity and a repair guarantee. Okay. Now, in terms of the specific bore itself, I would say we're, committing to do that, given with this unforeseen caveat, because we haven't actually gone out and investigated the area, if you will, and did a review or survey of any type. And to my knowledge, haven't received any information from Mr. Dodson-Rod around the specific installation of the drain line. And so I think there's more work to do to check those boxes and figure that out. What I'm saying is we're committed to doing that.
Okay, let's go to, I don't know if you have your testimony, but page 11, that's Exhibit C, Valera Hayen, and I have some questions about that. And then Mr. liable if you're able to get Exhibit 54 passed around. So, sir, I'm looking at what you've submitted here as of yesterday. Did this get prepared yesterday? I mean, I suppose you have a map person that put this together, or when was this prepared?
I believe this was prepared on Friday / Saturday.
All right. Now, do you know if the red line that you've got here on page 11 of your rebuttal testimony, does that move the proposed pipeline further away from Ms. Haynes' home, or do you know the new distance from her home if that were to be implemented?
I do not know the distance, and I don't see it here.
Do you know if the red line proposed here stays out of her virgin prairie grasses?
It looks like it does, but again, I don't know for sure.
And does it stay out of and far enough away from Native American burial sites on her property?
We would have to survey it to verify that. So it's, again, to do any of these, we would have to be doing some survey to determine if this was a permittable route or a route that avoided certain features.
And you, I think, were in the room when Mr. Powell last testified to his pre-filed testimony where he said, quote, "We know where the cultural sites or cultural resources," I can't remember the word, "are." Do you remember that testimony?
I don't, not
Okay.
that specifically.
All right. And then to suggest the purple line, your current route, you would agree that, I mean, you would still, to your logic, need all of the same information that you apparently don't have to suggest the red line. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. The red line has not been surveyed. And so, this is here's a alternative of things we could do to help address the concerns of Haynes. And again, until we actually go out in the field and survey it, and quite frankly, hear from the Haynes around what is their input on a route that addresses their concerns, those things all have to come together.
All right. And I think Exhibit 54 has been passed around. I hope so. And I believe it's been emailed. And I think one will be coming to you, sir, in a moment.
All right.
I think everybody has it.
All right.
Oh, yep, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't know you hadn't handed it to him.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm not going to ask you a bunch of questions because this is just being handed to you. But, since we got your document yesterday, tried to turn this around with Ms. Haynes quickly. But, sir, what I represent this to be is you see an RTA with a line, and that's a southern line, and then it starts heading west and then back up north in section 2021 there. That's Ms. Haynes' preferred reroute, and then reroute B is the second least bad reroute. So I would just respectfully request that your team take a look at this and maybe we can circle back on this. Unless you have any comments right out of the gate to tell me why this is impossible.
No comments, just a little look at it.
All right, I would offer Exhibit 54.
Any objection to 54?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Pella?
No objection.
All right, 54 is received.
Thank you. And then if we go to the next page, sir, in your pre-filed testimony, which would be page 12 on Exhibit C, the Starobas, I'm just curious, you show one of their parcels there near the Lugert land parcel, but what about the second parcel, which is part of the east half of section 35, 132, 50 1, have you agreed to make route modifications on that portion of your proposed route?
Yeah, so I'll just start with what's shown on Exhibit C, page 12. It's really just showing that the current route is what Mr. Stroba had requested. And I knew that because I was working with Mr. Gorger, who owns the property in the upper right-hand piece of that diagram. And he was talking to Mr. Stroba and helped me understand, or helped us understand, that diagonal crossing. And we incorporated it into the route and were able to get that approval from the Richland County Commission to cross at that angle. The property that's off the page would be the next track on to the east or to the right of the diagram on page 12. I recall from Mr. Stroba's testimony in Wapaton that he wanted a change to that route. I'm willing to look at that with him. I didn't fully understand what he was asking for there. So I can't comment, comment in terms of can we do it today, but just that would like to meet with him and understand exactly what that is, and then what's possible there. One of the limitations in this case is, that's a railroad that's crossing the property and separating Gorger's property from his. Typically we have to cross railroads at 90 degrees. And the sketch that I saw, I think that you submitted, didn't include a 90-degree crossing, and there were just some other things we'd have to understand to determine what we can do and what we can't do there.
Okay, so for the items that you didn't understand relative to his other parcel that's unaddressed here, what was kind of your thought process of gaining that understanding? Were you gonna email me or send a letter, or how were you going to get that understanding that you say you didn't have?
Yeah, we would start communicating. And again, I think the last correspondence that I'm aware of here, again, I've had limited involvement in these tracks outside of, the Bismarck reroute, but there are some, such as Mr. Gorger, that I have been involved in, and just because Terry and I have a relationship that goes back to, 12 years ago or so. And we started having problems down, and we're getting a lot of questions from his neighbors. And I went down there and we met several times and had 20 plus landowners in the room together. And most of them ended up working out easements with us. Mr. Stroba was never part of that. So the first step here would be for us to communicate with each other around, what are the questions, and see if we can't work to a resolution.
Well, yeah, I agree. I guess that maybe I asked a bad question. So, he testified in Wapaton, and I just wanted to make sure so we're not ships passing in the night. You then said you just told me you were confused by his testimony relative to his other piece in Wapaton, and I just wanted to make sure, is this how I had to learn about your confusion, by cross-examining you, or are you going to reach out on that, or what was your plan?
Yeah, let's reach out.
Okay.
I'll have our attorneys contact you, or if it's easier, I'll just contact Stroba directly.
And then as to the Lugert's property, based on what you're showing here on page 13, do you believe that alleviates their concerns based on their testimony that they've provided in this matter, both last year and recently in Wapaton?
I believe this is similar to what they requested or you requested. But in terms of, I don't know that, without talking to them, I don't know that it addresses their concerns, but I think it's similar to what you sent to us.
Okay, and you understand, and it very well might be, sir, but you understand all of those suggestions were in, far lower on the totem pole than just reroute around the property. So have you considered any reroute around the Lugert property, like to the north or the south of it?
Not at this time.
All right. And then next one to the APH Farms. We got a glimpse of this earlier today with Mr. Hagerat, John, and he expressed his opinions on it. Have you, Summit, looked at options either to the north or the south around the Hagerat land?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, I haven't been involved in these tracks. What I do know is, I think this again reflects the approximate route that was identified in our communication from you. But that's the limit of my knowledge of this specific property.
All right. And then same question, sir, to the next page 15, the Rockstead parcel. Based on the objections that have been submitted and you're aware of, do you believe that, well, let me just strike that. Have you looked at a reroute option that would eliminate placement of the proposed hazardous pipeline on the Rockstead property?
I personally have not been involved in a reroute that avoided the Rocksteads.
Okay. And who, I understand you were heavily involved in Bismarck, but who would be that person that's kind of looking at, for instance, the Rocksteads and the APH Farms parcels?
So that'll be our, pipeline routing team. Again, as I've committed to here, I'll take the lead and initiate and try to figure this out with your clients.
All right. And then the Malloy piece on page 16, it apparently is the red line is a reroute that kind of mirrors the southern boundary line as it curves around. And so have you looked at a potential reroute, sir, that avoids the Malloy ground altogether?
I have not, and I'm not aware of one.
Okay. And then that takes us to page 17, the Wallach, same question there. Are you aware of any work on selecting a route that would avoid the Wallach land?
I am not.
And then that answers the same for page 18, the Shirley Wallach land as well.
That's correct. As you can see, there's lots of wetlands out there, and so it's a challenging area of the state.
Correct. I agree with that. Okay. All right. I don't have anything further, sir. Thank you.
Commissioner Chrisman, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. I think just one, but it applies to basically all of Exhibit C. I got kind of confused along the way. First, I thought that these were, not finalized because I think you indicated that they haven't been surveyed, but these were proposals that Summit is willing to discuss with these landowners who are objecting. But then sometimes you're saying you haven't looked at anything. So are these the requests from the landowners where they would prefer to have the pipeline at? Or are these things that are these reroutes that Summit is proposing could be looked at to satisfy some of the concerns that you've heard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as I understand the question, it's some of both. In most cases, the landowners that have provided us an alternate route on their property, we've looked at that and said, yeah, we think we can do that. But we need to survey it to verify that what we think. So it's just purely looking at it from a desktop perspective. Then there are a couple of others that said, well, we want you to move it entirely off of our property or a reroute that doesn't include their properties. in which case we've taken a look at it and, well, we first need to go engage with the other landowners and we need to survey the route. And so it gets complicated. It's a lot simpler when a landowner's asking us for a reroute on their property, because now they are in total control of, can we survey it, and can we then, if we make that change, proceed to an agreement, an easement agreement. When it's somebody else, we haven't talked to neighbors that I'm aware of to look at alternate routes around that property. Now, our team may have previously to this, but again, my involvement here, since the hearing started to today on these tracks, we have not done that.
Okay, and then based on your map that you showed, the east of Bismarck area there in that reroute,
Yes.
it sure would look to me like it's just short of 4 miles, as you indicated. Did you have any discussion with Mr. Wachter since that testimony about, the map that he had in front of him and the confusion on that distance?
Yes, I did. I talked to him after the hearing. I told him that, told him just what I testified to here. And I told him that I would correct it. And he's like, yeah, he hadn't seen the map before or indicated he hadn't. So.
Okay. No other questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Hogan Hoffert?
I think it's just, looking at exhibit 101, I think Mr. Flanagan testified based on the map 100. They looked at your map that was submitted 100 and they developed map 101. Is that your understanding from his testimony?
My understanding is they looked at the map, and I'd have to see which number it is specifically, but
I thought he referenced 100.
And is that in the black book?
Black binder. EC 100. Should be the first exhibit.
Oh. That's what I recall.
Okay. So,
I recall that he was referencing this map.
right. He referenced map, the 100, and then based on their programming, they developed 101, in which Mr. Wachter testified. Correct?
That was my understanding, yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same on how this map came about
Yes.
based off of your initial 100 map.
Yeah, understood. But I could tell by comparing the two that this doesn't match, 100 and 101 don't match each exactly. And that's the difference I'm showing on my exhibit.
Okay.
B.
So we have before us a lot of exhibits, a lot of maps.
Yep.
So as we go forward, if something has changed, can we expect an updated map, frequently as things change so we can look at it? Or how's that process going to work? Because just today, I don't know how many maps we've gotten, so as we move forward, how are we going to get updated maps in a timely fashion?
Yeah, that's a reasonable question.
Or a reasonable request?
Yeah, a reasonable request, yes. The way I understand it is that, we filed the updated route, the current route in January, and the map book reflects all of that routing. And then we discussed here today some potential reroutes or modifications on all these properties. At some point, then we would update that again and submit the updated routes. But it's also my understanding if those changes are less than 1.5 miles, then they're considered minor in nature. And then they're still updated with the commission, but, and into the docket. I'll have to defer to others that are, I guess, more familiar with that process than I am. I'm just saying that, we'll provide updates, as frequently as the commission would like us to provide them, but that's just been the process, as I understand it.
So we have to request it.
I would say that you don't have to, you could request it, as I understand it. Or we could file it, which we would at some point in time say, okay, we've done all of these, we've confirmed them, surveyed them, secured easements, now let's file or let's update the route. But I am not familiar with exactly what that timing or practice has been, or quite frankly should be. So it can work either way is the way I understand it. But certainly we'll be communicating with, with Victor and trying to make sure we are providing the commission what the commission needs in a timely way.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
One question. What are your rules of engagement with represented landowners? You were saying that you'll talk directly to landowners, but not to attorneys, and attorneys talk to attorneys. Is there kind of a rubric you have here that you follow?
That's a great question. What I follow is if a landowner is represented by an attorney, I will have our attorney or our land guy work with their attorney. Sometimes landowners reach out to me directly or us directly or request a meeting with me. And if they request to meet with me, I will always meet with them. And if they want their attorney to be there, then he'll come with them. And sometimes they don't want their attorney to be there, or they say, well, I just want to get some information, and we'll do it that way. But that's the way I engage with or have engaged with landowners. I don't know that there's a rubric.
No further questions.
Any redirect, Mr. Glut?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Basons.
Thank you.
Next witness.
The applicant calls David Daum.
Your Honor,
Yes.
while Mr. Dom is taking the stand, I just want to remind, in case there's different people in the room, that I have that other commitment at about 3. And so I'll be leaving for that reason, but I'll review the recording.
All right. Thank you for the reminder. All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Dom. I'll have you start by stating your full name and spelling your last name for the record.
Yeah, it's David James Daum. Last name is D as in David, A-U-M as in Mary.
And Mr. Dom, did you hear me go through the penalties for perjury earlier today?
I did.
And do you understand what perjury is?
I do.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Malberg.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Daum, over the weekend, did you prepare or cause to be prepared a document titled Rebuttal Testimony of David J. Daum on behalf of SCS Carbon Transport LLC dated June 2, 2024?
Yes, I did.
When you wrote that testimony, were the answers true and correct?
Yes, they were.
If I asked you those same questions today, would your answers be the same or substantially the same?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to make?
I do not.
Your Honor, we'd offer the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Daum as SCR 20.
Right, Mr. Pelham, any objection?
No objection.
Mr. Phillips
No objection.
and Mr. Jordy?
Yep, same objections in improper rebuttal and relevance and foundation. Thank you.
All right, those objections are noted, but I will admit SCS 20.
Now, Mr. Dom, I'm going to briefly go over the points of testimony that you gave, and understanding that you're third in line today. And so for some of these, significant portions of your testimony was addressed. Generally speaking, though, your rebuttal testimony addressed 4 issues. One is first responder meetings. Another was equipment requests, the grant program, and the Texas A&M training, right?
That's correct.
With respect to the equipment requests, I'm going to skip over the first responder and emergency manager meetings based on the content of your written testimony and the lengthy discussions today. I don't think we need to go over that again now, but can you summarize what you have to say in your written testimony about the equipment requests and the grant program?
Yes, Summit has committed to providing a grant to each county that the pipeline runs through in the amount of $50,000 and $1,000 per mile of pipeline in that county for the county emergency managers to use however they see fit for what they may need. And that is in addition to carbon dioxide monitors that we have already committed to providing.
Beyond the carbon dioxide monitors that you have already committed to providing, are you aware of any outstanding request for equipment from any first responders?
I am not.
Okay, then, Mr. Dom, with respect to the Texas A&M training, can you give a brief synopsis of what your testimony tells us about that?
Yeah, the Texas A&M training is something that was brought to our attention that provides information around CO2 emergency response, pipeline basics, emergency response planning, how to use air monitoring equipment, those types of safety things. And we've offered, we have the availability of some spots at that training when they do have it. And we've offered that to provide some folks from the emergency response community the opportunity to go down there at Summit's cost and go to the training.
Your Honor, I don't have anything further and would expose Mr. Dom to cross-examination.
Mr. Pelham, any questions?
I don't, thank you.
Mr. Shook? Mr. Phillips, any questions? All right, Mr. Jordy, did you want to go first?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Sir, your title is, let's see, the Senior Director of Health, Safety, Security, and Environmental for Summit, right?
That's correct.
And that's because safety is a very important part of this project, right?
Yes.
Now, your experience, according to your CV, you worked many years for British Petroleum, is that right?
Yes, I work for BP.
All right, and is that where you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I worked for BP for 22 years.
All right, very well. And is that where you became familiar with Mr. James Powell at BP?
I did meet Mr. Powell at BP, I believe, back in 2001.
Did you, throughout your BP tenure, have any involvement at all with the Deepwater Horizon project?
I did not.
All right. You provided information, some additional on these safety tour meetings. And just to be absolutely clear, those are different and separate and apart from the emergency response meetings that Mr. Lang was talking about. Is that right?
That's correct.
And during the safety tour meetings, were any information related to plume dispersion or modeling, risk analysis, hazard distances, those kind of things shared with the public?
The only thing regarding dispersion modeling in there was that it was a requirement of PHMSA that we do dispersion modeling and what we use it for, which is to inform our integrity management programs and our emergency response programs.
All right. And as the director, the senior director of dealing with safety for Summit, are you familiar, do you make yourself familiar with the PHMSA rules and regs and the Pipeline Safety Act?
Yes, I'm familiar with PHMSA regulations.
And are you familiar that under the Pipeline Safety Act, the Secretary of Transportation did not prescribe to PHMSA any ability to locate or route a CO2 pipeline facility?
Object to the extent it's calling for a legal conclusion about the regulations.
Do you want to rephrase your question?
Yeah, I don't want a legal conclusion. I'm just curious if he's familiar with that regulation, yes or no. I don't need his interpretation of it.
Can you tell me what the regulation is?
Yeah, so we've got the Pipeline Safety Act, and then we've got section 60014 sub E, which states, quote, "This chapter does not authorize the Secretary of Transportation to prescribe the location or routing of a pipeline facility," end quote. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar that PHMSA does not cite pipelines.
Okay. And then are you also familiar that PHMSA cannot issue federal safety standards for a pipeline's location or a pipeline's route?
Object to the extent it's asking about a legal conclusion and relevance to the extent we're just going to have Mr. Jordy read out of the guidelines.
Yeah, can you reword?
Well, you're not just the safety person, the senior safety person. And I'm just curious, sir, as your familiarity with PHMSA and your preparation as the senior safety person for this project, are you aware one way or another whether or not PHMSA can or can't issue federal safety standards for a pipeline's location or route in the state of North Dakota?
I don't believe that PHMSA has a regulation to cite pipelines in North Dakota.
And because PHMSA doesn't get involved in where a CO2 pipeline is located or routed, would you agree that there's no prohibition for utilizing safety considerations as a factor in where the pipeline might be routed within North Dakota?
I'll object to the extent that one's calling for a legal conclusion as to speculation about what can and can't be considered and by whom, and also relevant, and we're outside the scope of the testimony. I don't understand what this line of questioning does in relation to the rebuttal testimony that's filed.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the relevance of your question either, Mr. Jordy.
Okay, I can maybe try to help on that. So did you personally go to these safety meetings and not just the secret ones, or what'd you call them, the safety tour meetings? Were you personally there?
I was.
Okay, and you're probably aware of, or maybe you're not, questions related to, you know, what can a county do? What can a state do? Where do the feds come in? I mean, help us understand. I mean, did you participate in any type of discussions in these meetings relative to your proposed project here, dealing with those kind of questions, kind of the interchange of who does what?
I'm going to object to the form of that as compound. There are lots of questions in there. I think that a simpler question will get a simpler answer out of this.
Can you break that down, Mr. Jordy?
I'll take as long as we need, be happy to. So we have established that you personally were at the safety tour meetings. You were personally at the secret meetings. And the question is, were you personally asked, or are you personally aware of anyone in any of these meetings asking any questions related to the interchange of what localities can do, what the state can and can't do, and versus what the federal government can and can't do relative to your siting of your pipeline project?
I don't recall any specific questions to me regarding that. What I do know that is what we had on one of our boards was the regulations that apply to us.
And when you say the regulations that apply to us, are you meaning the federal regulations that apply to Summit as an operator?
Federal and state.
Okay. Okay. Now, you were asked if in your experience, has Summit's outreach, it's conducted with the emergency responders typical, and is that outreach you're talking about these more detailed secret meetings starting in November 2023, or how did you take that question that you answered?
I'm going to object to the form to the extent that these meetings continue to be called secret meetings. That's not reflecting the actual testimony.
And I think just so our record is clear, Mr. Jordy, when you say secret meetings, are you referring to the meetings where the general public was not invited to them?
Yeah, where it was only for the invited list and then the secret information that the parties here don't have. Those meetings, the ones I think Mr. Lang laid out in his testimony that I believe Mr. Dom was a participant in.
I think we all understand which meetings are being referenced, but to avoid an objection on the form of the question, they are not secret meetings. Members of first responders in several counties were invited and came. Emergency managers were invited and came. So the implication that they're secret meetings, rather than having to object to the form of this question each time, if we could just not mischaracterize them.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the characterization of a secret meeting is appropriate, Mr. Jordy. So I'd ask that you refrain from using that phrase. And with that said, did you object? You didn't object to the question, just the
mischaracterization of the nature of the meetings.
Mr. Jordy, we might need your question again.
Sure. So the confidential meetings where none of the other parties to this proceeding were allowed to be present, those are the meetings I'm talking about. And are those the meetings that you're referencing in your answer on page 4 to the question, based on your experiences, the outreach that Summit has conducted with emergency responders typical ?
No, I was talking generally in outreach in general to emergency responders and first responders.
In terms of this 50,000,
which may include those meetings.
Okay, very good. So just kind of generally, whatever meetings you had with first responders, you're kind of including all of those. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
And then this grant program, and did I hear you right that a $50,000 grant would that be paid to the county with the intent that the emergency manager can spend it on whatever he or she sees fit? Is that the intent?
If I may, Your Honor, sort of a point of personal privilege here. It may just be my hearing that's going, but can you pull that microphone just a little closer, Dave? I'm having trouble hearing.
Okay, is that better?
I think so. Use your outside voice.
Sorry.
Did you need me to state that again,
Yeah,
sir?
can you repeat that, please?
Sure. I'm on page 5 of your testimony, if that helps. But this $50,000 grant, if that's something that Summit would, they're going to pay it into the county, or you pay it directly to emergency manager. What's the mechanism? And then are there any restrictions or guidelines on what to do with that money?
No, it's a grant into the emergency managers for them to use as they see fit for equipment or whatever else they may need to respond to incidents.
And when you say a grant, that kind of term of art, rather than you're going to write a check for $50,000, do you mean that if emergency manager in XYZ county says, well, we only spent $1,000, that you'd retain $49,000? Or I'm just trying to figure out the mechanism, if you can help me out on how that works.
That is not my understanding.
Okay. And then is there a contract with the county? Say, for instance, the current owners of Summit sell before this is constructed. I mean, is there something in writing where we can force you, or a county can force you to pay those funds, or how is that working?
I don't know that there's a contract at this point, but there's a letter that serves as a commitment to that grant.
And the additional $1,000 per mile of pipeline in a specific county, is that per year? Is that one time at construction, or what's that?
That's part of the one-time grant. And oftentimes there are other grants that come later during the project.
All right.
But right now, this is a one-time $50,000 grant plus $1,000 per mile in the county, to each county that the pipeline goes through.
Are you aware that some lobbyists in South Dakota lobbied to do away with such a requirement in Senate Bill SB 201 in South Dakota, the per mile commitment?
I'll object to the extent that we're talking about apparently South Dakota legislation when Mr. Dahm is not testifying about South Dakota legislation.
I'll sustain that objection.
How much is the grant for the affected landowners, business owners, and occupants? What's their grant amount?
I don't know which grant you're talking about.
Well, don't you have one for the people that actually are living, working near the proposed pipeline? If you're giving the county at large $50,000, what are you proposing specifically for safety related things for the actual affected persons?
I'm not aware of any grant for that purpose.
And you're certainly aware that a county can construct its own emergency response plan, correct? They don't have to rely on Summit's emergency response plan, do they?
No, a county can construct a emergency response plan. Typically, they're called pre-plans for different things that may be in their county, for different scenarios or businesses or whatever it may be in their county.
And in order to create a robust and accurate and informed county level emergency response plan, you would agree that the county should be provided not just a high level summary, but the exact plume modeling, dispersion modeling data that Summit's conducted, correct?
I'm going to object to this line of questioning, which is going to go down the exact same road or line of questioning that has gone on this topic with nearly every witness. There's no reason to do it again.
I'll allow him to answer this question, but Mr. Jordy, I don't want to go down this road again because we've gone over this ground many, many times during this hearing.
What's your answer, sir?
Whenever an emergency response plan, whether it's the county or it's us, we're required to do it by PHMSA, which also requires us to have conversation with emergency responders. We talk about all the information that's relevant, and if they want to use that information in their pre-plan or plan, whatever they call it, they can do that. And we are also going to be putting together what we call initial response tactics based on information that we receive from first responders, as well as the information and data that we have regarding the pipeline, to have the best emergency response plan that we can have in a collaborative fashion with the best response capabilities and technologies.
In terms of the Texas A&M training, you state that Summit's invited North Dakota emergency managers to the course at Summit's cost. Is there a something in writing, some type of a contract whereby this is an ongoing annual training and retraining for new folks that might become employed in the various emergency response offices or volunteer firefighters, for instance, or how do you envision that working?
Again, no contract in place, but we have sent a letter to for example, Ms. Singer, the emergency manager for Burley, offering that training and committing to that. And I've, personally in the meetings that I've been in, brought that up and asked if any of the, in the case of the meetings I was at, the fire chiefs or any of their personnel would be interested in going, to that training at this point in the project to learn more about pipeline basics and CO2 safety.
And I appreciate that. My question is a little more specific. Is the commitment here to offer participation in this program on an annual basis to those persons within the North Dakota affected counties that may want to go, or is this a kind of upfront offer? I'm just trying to get a little more meat on what this offer is.
Yeah, so we get, as I mentioned, we get a certain amount of spots, usually 2 to 4 spots per session. There's usually about 4 sessions per year that we can send people to. And we'll continue to do that as long as the course is provided. It's a third-party course, but we will send people to those courses as long as it's there.
And when you say at Summit's cost, is that the course cost, or does that include travel expenses so there's not a burden on county resources, or where does Summit's cost contribution or reimbursement stop?
Yeah, so for the people we've sent, we've paid for expenses and the course costs.
Okay, and the expenses, trip to get there.
Travel, hotel,
Yeah,
meals.
okay. Very good.
Yes.
All right. I think you have here that no North Dakota emergency response personnel has taken Summit up on this opportunity. Is that still true as we sit here today?
As far as I know, that is true.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Your Honor, I don't have any more questions for this witness, but before I pass, I just want to clean up. I'm almost positive I offered Exhibit 57, which were the photos of the Olson family that I said we'd produce later, but to the extent I failed to offer Exhibits 57, I just want to clean that up and get that admitted here.
You previously offered and I accepted 57.
Okay, I thought so. Thank you. And thank you, sir. Nothing further.
Mr. Phillips, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
There's been some discussion in your testimony about grants to the counties. Are you aware of Burleigh County's requirement for accepting and spending grants, that those have to be approved at a public county commission meeting?
I am not.
Your current position is, if I can read it correctly, Senior Director of Health, Safety, Security, and Environmental at Summit, is that correct?
That's correct.
What education, training, or experience of any kind do you have specific to carbon dioxide pipelines as it relates to emergency response procedures?
So my background is I have a bachelor's degree in occupational safety and health, a minor in environmental health, and a master's in industrial management, and I'm a certified safety professional.
And that was a lot of broad terms. I do want to narrow it in specifically to CO2 pipelines.
As far as CO2 pipelines specifically, I have never worked on a CO2 pipeline project previously.
And if I understand your testimony correctly, you were present at the November 27th, 2023 meeting with the Burleigh County emergency responders and managers, is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to have you look at that black binder and turn to Exhibit BC 119.
119?
Yes.
Okay, I think I'm there.
Did you hear the testimony earlier from Mr. Lang about this document?
About what? Sorry, I didn't hear the end of your question.
Did you hear the testimony earlier by Mr. Lang when he testified about this document?
Yes, I was in the room.
And is this a document that you provided to Mary Sanger with Burleigh County?
I did after that meeting, per request and per the documents that were requested in that meeting.
Is it your understanding that Summit intends to comply with all of the requirements in this guideline document?
The document is a guidance document. I believe we either comply with or we will comply with those that are applicable to the project. Some may not be applicable to the project, and some items may be applicable only in certain situations.
Are you familiar with which ones are applicable and which ones are not?
For example, there's a piece about forced air displacement and using fans as emergency response equipment. In some scenarios, we may use those depending on the situation, and some they wouldn't work and we wouldn't use them. That's just an example that I can think of off the top of my head.
What about the portions of the document that do clearly apply? Does Summit attempt to comply with the requirements in this document?
Yes, I believe so. There's requirements in there that reference PHMSA regulations, and we have to comply with those. specifically around emergency response.
We'll look at a specific one here too, page 6 of that document.
Okay, I'm there.
And the heading there at the top, 3.1, community stakeholder outreach. It lists sort of a list of stakeholders there. Does Summit or has Summit reached out to these various stakeholders? We can start with the first, the affected public.
Well, I'll go back and say, so this is community outreach, and it references 195-440, which is the public awareness program, which also references recommended practice 1162 on public awareness, which is another API document. And those are requirements that we will have to follow when the time comes. At this point, you know, the public awareness program isn't in place because we're not in operation. Okay, have we talked to the affected public? Yes, the safety tour meetings that we're having and those types of things. But it's a little premature and it's a little bit different what we're presenting there than what would be specific to the requirements of this regulation.
I don't think I caught what you said triggers when these requirements will come into place. Can you explain that?
When we're operating a pipeline with CO2 in it.
Regardless of whether it's required at this time, has Summit reached out to one of the items there, fire departments, law enforcement, local emergency planning committees?
Yes.
What about hazmat teams?
Not specifically, but sometimes indirectly, because hazmat teams are part of the fire departments.
Excavators and contractors?
Not that I'm aware of at this time.
What about public officials?
If you consider public officials such as county commissioners and then yes.
Would Summit have records of all the public officials it's reached out to?
I believe there's records of all the I believe there's records of all the meetings, commission meetings that Summit has attended.
There was some prior testimony about whether county officials were invited to a meeting in Emmons County. Do you know if commissioners were invited to that meeting in Emmons County?
I am not aware.
Would the documents exist in Summit's possession that establish whether or not those officials were invited?
From what I understand, how the process works around public outreach and public outreach, that any meetings that that we ask for or we send to officials would be documented in a system that we have within Summit Carbon.
Part of the outreach that you did was in relation to this November meeting in 2023 with Burleigh County, correct?
Yes, I would say that was outreach.
And I'm sorry to jump back a little bit, but I want to make sure I cover this here. You talked earlier about I'd asked you about education, training, and experience, and you'd indicated this is the first CO2 pipeline you've worked on. You didn't really address education or training. And what education or training do you have specific to CO2 pipelines?
So I've been to the TEACS course as one reference of training. I've attended that. My education as a whole covers many different aspects of safety, whether, and a broad array of different chemicals. So I've worked around CO2, I've worked around H2S, I've worked around xylene, refined products, so on and so forth. The regulations basically translate to whatever the product may be. The product, whether through safety data sheets and their properties is what then we manage the risk to.
Do you agree that CO2 release and a subsequent response would present some unique circumstances that are different from more common products like oil and gas, natural gas?
I would say that CO2 has some different properties than natural gas, and it has some of the same. They're both simple asphyxiants, so they displace oxygen. CO2 is heavier than air. Natural gas is lighter, but often contains things like butane and propane, which are heavier, and under the right conditions could cause a cloud to drift and sit in low-lying areas as well. CO2 is non-flammable. Natural gas is flammable. So those are just some of the properties, but yes, I mean, there's differences.
And this is your first time working on a CO2 pipeline?
Pipeline specific, yes.
Are those differences between CO2 and some other chemicals part of the reason it's important to educate stakeholders?
I think it's always important to educate the stakeholders, no matter what it is. And that's why the regulations, like I said, translate, whether it's natural gas pipeline or it's a crude oil pipeline or it's a CO2 pipeline, you still have to do the same things. You have to do the public outreach. You have to do the emergency response plan. You have to do the training. You have to share the emergency response plan with first responders. You have to train first responders, so on and so forth.
Still looking at Exhibit BC 119, the second full paragraph there on page 6 talks about operators becoming familiar with potential public gathering centers such as schools, hospitals, et cetera, along the route. What work has Summit done in relation to things like schools and hospitals and the like?
So those types of things will be part of, I mentioned earlier, the initial response tactics is something we do in addition to the emergency response plans. And that is understanding, that'll be done for each mile of the pipeline, and that is understanding what is in the areas of the pipeline and what could be affected by a potential release, from the pipeline. And so, when the line gets finalized, we'll look at that data and that information and collect it. And that'll be some of the discussions we have with first responders as to how we would respond specifically in an area where there may be a hospital or there may be a school or there may be a few homes or whatever it may be. And that's what those specific response tacticals are for.
That one doesn't have a footnote to any federal regulations. Is that part of a federal regulation, or is it just one of the best practices in this guideline?
I don't recall specifically if that's in the regulation or just the guideline at this point.
Is there a process in place to make sure that Summit will go ahead and do that at the appropriate time?
Can you clarify that? Go ahead and do what?
Well, you testified earlier about how certain things will become requirements under federal law when you're operating the pipeline. It appears may not be a federal regulation. Is there anything that's going to trigger Summit to know to go out and comply with this best practice?
The best practice? No, the regulation, yes. And which this is part of the regulation. 440, which is the public outreach regulation.
To be clear, what we're talking about here is becoming familiar with public gathering centers. Does Summit have a plan to become familiar with any public gathering centers as part of its plan of action in relation to this pipeline project?
Yeah, I believe so. As I mentioned, that we will have to understand what could be impacted by a potential incident along the pipeline, and if there is one of these type of locations that are there, then we have to identify those, and that'll be part of the discussion we have with first responders as to how it's best to respond. Do they have the right equipment? Do we have the right equipment? So on and so forth, based on the guidance in this document.
There's a list here in that same section of things that should be considered when developing a plan of action. I'm not going to read them all off there, but you can read them, starting with ability to safely evacuate people from the school, hospital, or other place of gathering. Is that list part of a federal regulation?
I'm going to object to two things. One, to the form of that question, that he's going to ask him about a list that he just told him not to read. Second, going down this path, I think Mr. Dom has testified that they're going to comply with all the applicable regulations. He's testified now, beginning to be ad nauseum about line by line by line out of this document. I think it's becoming cumulative and unnecessary at this point.
Address that, Mr. Phillips.
Yes, Your Honor. I believe I said that I wouldn't read it out loud, but that the witness certainly can and should. But I think, you can say, yes, we're going to comply with all of the regulations and everything in this big document. I should have an opportunity to go through some of the details with him to confirm that this isn't a broad statement that's not based in reality. I should be able to test the veracity of that claim.
I'll allow him to answer.
Looking at this briefly, it looks like these are all things we would consider.
Looking at page 7, response drills and exercises. Has Summit conducted any response drills or exercises with Burleigh County?
Not to date.
Does it have a plan to do so at a certain time?
Yes, part of our timeline, and this was also communicated in the safety tour meetings, was that once we start construction, that's when training with first responders will start. And prior to going into operation, we will conduct exercises and drills with first responders and our personnel to make sure everybody's on the same page.
And what about section 3.3 on page 8? This deals with training of pipeline operators. What plan does Summit have for training of pipeline operators?
This is in regard to emergency response. Our pipeline operators that Summit will employ will will be trained as first responders.
Just one moment or two, Your Honor. I just want to check my notes. Thank you. No further questions.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert,
I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson?
You say that you will take requests for equipment and besides an oxygen-based breathing apparatus of some sort. Is there any sort of anticipated equipment that might be requested? I'm just curious.
We haven't heard too much besides the CO2 monitors, but I can tell you some of the things, small things we've thought of include things like reflective vests, because we may have people blocking traffic in a certain area, flashlights, road barricades, general things you would use to respond to an incident, block roads and keep people away.
So besides perhaps an oxygen-based breathing apparatus of some sort, there's really no other sort of specialized equipment?
No, I mean, in the document, the guidance document is there, and I mentioned it earlier, like fans, these big fans. Those will be things that will be evaluated for certain types of releases. What else? As I mentioned, it displaces oxygen. So, breathing apparatus, CO2 monitors. Those are the main response equipment that we would be looking at.
Thank you. No further questions.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
I do have one.
Okay.
You talked about the grants at the county level. What about the state level? Has there been any communication with North Dakota DES and offering the state? And I don't know if they're eligible, so. But at the state, like if there was a command center opened up or anything, has there been communications with the state?
Not that I am aware of at this time.
Is there anticipated communication with the state on emergency response?
I guess it's not something I've thought of at this point, but definitely can. Happy to do that.
That might be a good place to, have that communication with the state.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'm saying no further questions.
No, thank you.
Mr. Malberg, any redirect?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Dom.
Thank you.
Any further rebuttal witnesses on behalf of Summit?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Any other issues we need to address before we conclude today?
Your Honor. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that if we could just get a rundown as to what is anticipated tomorrow, so everyone is on the same page, so we don't start off tomorrow wondering where we're going to start.
Yep, and I'll just note that it's my understanding Emmons County intends to call, I think they filed a list, 2 to 5 or 6 witnesses, 1 for sure, and then 4 or 5 maybes, I think. And Mr. Jordy, I think your list had 2 witnesses.
Correct, to the Kurtzman Farm Trust, the two owners of that will testify. That's all I've got.
And on behalf of Summit, I know it's hard to guess, but do you anticipate rebuttal witnesses tomorrow?
At this time, we do not, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, other matters to discuss? Mr. Jordy, did you have something?
No, Mr. Pelham read my mind. I just wanted to be clear though, because I know we've kind of moved things up in the schedule and that's perfectly fine. But maybe Mr. Dublinsky, does that mean that Mr. Dom and Mr. Dillon are not going to be presented tomorrow? I just want to make sure I have the clear lay of the land. If I put my two people on and Mr. Brodden calls whoever he calls, is that the end of it? Or maybe you can clarify, Mr. Dublinsky.
Yeah, so my understanding from Judge Hogan's order was that we were expected to put on as much of our rebuttal case as we could today, and that she was leaving open the door to potentially allowing rebuttal of new material from tomorrow. Knowing the witness list at this time, I don't anticipate calling anybody. And if we did, I don't know whether that would be Mr. Dom or Mr. Basons or somebody else entirely. We have no current plans to put Dom or Dylan, I think were the two you mentioned, up tomorrow.
Okay, or anybody at this time is what I'm hearing.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I will note that we will take public testimony tomorrow too. So that's the other factor that item we have for our hearing tomorrow. All right, anything else? Just to clarify, Mr. Phillips, are you or Mr. Bakke appearing at tomorrow's hearing? I thought no.
I don't believe so, Your Honor.
Okay, all right. All right, well, I will note that it.
I'm sorry, one more thing.
Yep.
If I can, sorry. Did we determine if there might be this same setup for tomorrow, or is it going to be phone? And then if it's phone, if that could be circulated to me, I'd really appreciate it.
Phone, it should be this, sorry. I wasn't thinking about the phone question, so let me see. Yeah, so we do have a GoToMeeting link for tomorrow. If you don't have it, shoot me an email, I'll send it to you. You can certainly dial the phone option on that GoToMeeting. I know the sound contractor is there setting up right now. They're going to have at least limited connectivity. I don't know that we'll be able to do audio and video, but we will certainly be able to broadcast out audio is what I'm told. So you could have the audio connection for you would be available.
Okay, thank you. I'm sending you an email now. I appreciate it.
All right, I will note for our record, it's 3:44 p.m. and we will recess for today in Public Service Commission case number PU-22-391.